Hopefully you are doing well, Colonet Africa student. Welcome to this lesson. We are discussing sexual reproduction in plants. In flowering plants, the flower is the reproductive organ, and it is a specialized shoot made up of a modified stem and leaves. The stem-like part is the pedicel and receptacle, while the modified leaves form corolla and calyx. So this is the part of a flower. We have the petal, brightly colored. Then we have the stigma to receive pollen grains during pollination. We have style. We have ovary and ovule to form the female part of the flower. And then we have the receptacle here. And then we have the sepals. Then we have the stamen containing anther and filament, and these are the male parts of a flower. So what are the functions of these parts of a flower? So the flower is made up of the following parts: the calyx, and this one is made up of the sepals. And then in case where sepals are free, they form a polysepalous calyx. So they are not fused here, so they are free. That is polysepalous calyx. And when fused, they form gamosepalous calyx. The function of these sepals is to enclose and protect the flower when it is in bud, that is, early stages of development. And some flowers have an outer hole made up of sepal-like structures called epicalyx. We move to corolla, and this one consists of the petals, which are brightly colored in insect pollinated flower, so that color attracts the insect. If the petals are fused, they are the corolla is said to be gamopetalous, and if it is free, they are said to be polypetalous. We go to androecium, and this is the male part of the flower, and it is composed of stamen. Each stamen has filament whose end has an anther, and inside the anther are pollen sacs bearing pollen grains. So this is androecium. We have the anther which suspends the anther. Then anther contain the pollen sacs. So when these pollen sacs are opened, there are pollen grains. So these are all of this is the anther. So when you open these pollen sacs, then there are pollen grains. Then we move to the gynoecium, also called the pistil, and this is the female part of a flower. Consists of one or more carpels, and each carpel consists of an ovary, style. We have the ovary, we have the style, and the stigma. Then the ovary contains ovules which develop into seeds after fertilization. And remember, this ovary will develop into a fruit after fertilization. And if the other floral parts occur above the ovary on the receptacle, it is said to be inferior or epigenous. And if the ovary itself occurs above the other floral parts, then that a flower is superior or hypogenous, as seen in hibiscus. So we can use this table. We have types of flowers. We have hypogenous, perigenous, and epigenous. So this is hypogenous. We have the ovary or the gynoecium occurring above all these floral parts. And then we have perigenous. We have the other floral parts occurring on the sides of the ovary. So, and then the ovary is at the center of these floral parts. And then we go to epigeneus, where these other flower parts, okay, are occurring above the ovary, and this one is called an inferior ovary. For example, in the case of guava, so all those parts, the other parts, will be above the ovary. So in case where we have a monocarpous gynoecium, that is when it has one carpel. So one carpel is said to be monocarpous gynoecium. And if these carpels are free, then they are called apocarpous, as in the case of rose and bryophyllum. And in carpels that are fused, they are called cyanocarpous, as in the case of hibiscus. So let us discuss pollination in this lesson as well. So pollination is defined as the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. And there are two types of pollination. First, we have self-pollination, which is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of the same flower. That is why it is called self-pollination. So it is within pollination within the flower. So the other type is called cross-pollination, and this one involves the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of a different flower, but they should be of the same species. So we will have flower A, its pollen grains being transferred to flower B of this of a different plant, but they should be of the same species. For example, if it is beans, or one it should be just one particular type of species. So we go to agents of pollination, and they include wind, insects, among other. And how are these flowers adapted to pollination? For instance, in case of insect pollinated flowers, they have large brightly colored petals which attract insects, and then they have nectaries that secrete nectar which is sweet and has a good smell, that serve as a bait for the insect. This one will make the insects move to those plants to collect the nectar, which is food to these insects. They also have a small sticky stigma which enables the pollen grains from the insect to stick onto it. So let us use this table to compare the adaptations of an insect pollinated flower and a wind pollinated flower. For example, the petals, they are brightly colored to attract insects, but the petals are large and brightly colored. But in case of wind pollinated flowers, they are usually small and dull, because wind blows the pollen grains, so there is no need to attract insects. When we come to scent or the smell and nectar, the insect pollinated flowers are usually having smell with some nectars that attract insects, but wind pollinated flowers do not have any smell, neither nectar, because they do not attract insects. When it comes to number of pollen grains, insect pollinated flowers have a moderate or medium number of pollen grains, because the insects transfer pollen grains efficiently. But in wind pollinated flowers, there must be large amount of pollen grains, because most pollen grains are not transferred to another flower. Some are wasted as the wind blows. And for pollen grains in insect pollinated flowers, they are sticky or having spike-like structures, so that they can stick well onto the body of the insect. And as the insect moves to another plant, they will be rubbed and shed off to that flower. But for this wind pollinated flower, the pollen grains are smooth and light, so that they increase the buoyancy to be easily carried by the wind without clumping or sticking together. For the case of anthers, the anthers are within the flower and they are strong and firmly attached so that they do not break as the insect brushes against. But in wind-pollinated flower, the anthers occur outside the flower. They are even loose and long, as they have loose and long filaments to release pollen grains easily. For the case of the stigma, insect-pollinated flower, the stigma occurs inside and it is even sticky so that the pollen grains can stick to it when the insect sheds the pollen grains. But in case of wind-pollinated flowers, the stigma occurs outside the flower. It is even feathery and it forms a network so that it can catch the flying or the spreading pollen grains. We can also look at the mechanisms that hinder self-pollination. We have the stamen ripening earlier so that it can release pollen grains before the stigma is mature, and that is a condition or a situation called protandry. An example having or exhibiting such is the sunflower. So protandry is when the male parts ripen early so that it can release the pollen grains, but at the same time the female parts of a flower is not mature. We have another situation where the stigma or the female parts matures early and then it dries before the male part or the anthers release the pollen grains, and this is called protogeny. This one is common in grasses. So in protogeny, the stigma or the female parts matures early, but the pollen grains are not yet released. Another factor hindering self-pollination, but also these factors promote cross-pollination. We have self-sterility or incompatibility. And in this case, the pollen grains are sterile or they are not fertile to the stigma of the same flower, as in the case of maize. In the case of maize flower, we have another factor called heterostyle, and this is a condition of having different arrangements of stigma and style. And majority of plant species have both male and female reproductive structures on the same plant, and they are called hermaphrodites or monoecious plants, and they have brightly colored and scented flowers which have nectaries that attract them. So we have, in this case, we are having both male and female structures on the same plant, so they are called mono. So the mono means one plant having those structures. So, and as these insects collect nectar and pollen grains, as the insects collect pollen grains from these plants having brightly colored and scented flowers with nectaries in them, pollen grains fall onto parts of their bodies and they are transferred from one flower to another. And in that case, self-pollination has been prevented, but at the same time, cross-pollination has been enhanced or promoted. Sometimes there are other plants having sexual structures on separate or different plants, and these ones are called dioecious because we have the male plant on one plant or on a different plant and a female plant or a female flower on a different plant. Such plants are called dioecious. An example is the pawpaw. We are done with examining the flower, so engage yourself with this assignment, and we meet in our next lesson. You may replay this video so that you can capture the assignment, and you can even discuss with your friends. I believe you are a great student. You can achieve a lot. See you.